As is frequently the case for most sermons on the topic of suffering for what you believe in, I don't expect that you're going to like this sermon all that much. Sorry. How's that for a rousing beginning? Today we begin a 3-week sermon series on the tiny epistle of 1 Peter, a letter toward the end of the New Testament that was written to Christians for whom the practice of their faith within the culture where they lived had literally become a matter of life and death. The book is short, just 5 chapters, and if you have a few minutes this afternoon, I invite you to just sit down and read right through it. When you do, you'll see that the book contains some very beautiful passages of encouragement for the first Christians, some of which we heard today. You'll also notice that 1 Peter contains some troubling passages used recklessly and dangerously out of context for centuries. Passages like, "Slaves, obey your masters," and "Wives, submit to your husbands." For that reason, and for others, it has been the practice of most of the academy and a lot of preachers just to completely ignore 1 Peter because it clearly does not address the situation in which we find ourselves. And even we might have an immediate urge to dismiss this little letter as irrelevant to our modern lives. But I know that you like a challenge as much as I do. So for the next 3 weeks, we are going off lectionary and taking a deep dive into 1 Peter. Well, it is true that a lot in the book of 1 Peter is situationally specific. The author writes with some eloquence that reveals deeper and more universal themes around what it means to be a follower of Jesus in a world where the gospel of love is not the order of the day. The letter talks about how to live together in the community of Christ, and the letter addresses how the claim of faith in Jesus Christ impacts our most intimate relationships. 3 weeks. Being a Christian in the world, being a Christian in the church, being a Christian in my life. A practical manual. I often think of reading the letters toward the end of the Bible like sitting outside at a cafe on a pleasant afternoon. People are walking by, you're sipping coffee and trying to read a book. But at the table next to you, you can't help but overhear your neighbor talking on her cell phone. You can sort of tell what she's talking about, but you don't know the situation, and of course, you're only hearing one side of the conversation. Reading the letters of the first church leaders to the early communities of Christians is like overhearing a cafe conversation. We don't know exactly who was on the receiving end of the letters, or sometimes even who wrote them. We often don't know when the letters were written or the specific situations they were addressing. So we modern biblical scholars should always proceed with utmost care, aware of our distance from these readings' original settings, our ignorance of the details surrounding them, and the cultural lenses through which we cannot help but read the words on the page. That said, the inclusion of a little book like 1 Peter in our holy canon invites us to explore universal themes of the Christian experience. What do we, modern followers of Jesus, have in common with the readers of 1 Peter? In the case of 1 Peter, Peter Gomes says, we are privy to a conversation in the early church about how our faith invites us to order our lives, the public, corporate, and individual affairs of the community of Christ. And these are perpetual questions for all of us who call ourselves disciples of Jesus. So, with that perspective in mind, let's become biblical scholars for the next few minutes and learn what we can about the background of 1 Peter, a letter that was not written to us, but which we hold in our hands now, along with an invitation to think deeply about how it is that we live our faith in the world. We'll start with the author of 1 Peter. In short, it wasn't Peter. The early church had a handful of compelling leaders who traveled all over Asia Minor and founded little communities around the ideas that Jesus taught. And if you were in a community that, say, came to existence under the leadership of the Apostle Paul, for example, you and your community would reflect his style of leadership and teaching. With the work of these traveling leaders, different schools of thought arose in the early church. Communities in the tradition of Peter or Paul or Timothy or Priscilla. As these communities grew and became established, other leaders would emerge, like pastors who would teach and write in support of these fledgling communities. And to give their work legitimacy, they would often write in the tradition of a well-known leading founder. It's pretty clear that 1 Peter was not written by the Apostle Peter for two reasons. References to events that take place in the book happen after Peter had died, and the style, vocabulary, and grammar of the Greek that's used in 1 Peter would have been out of the reach, shall we say, of an Aramaic fisherman from Galilee. We presume then that 1 Peter was written by a church leader who saw him or herself working in the tradition of the Apostle Peter. We also presume from some hints in the text that the recipients in this letter were Gentiles, not Jews. They were new converts to Christianity. And while 1 Peter was probably an encyclical that went around to different communities, it is certainly addressing very specific social, cultural, and political situations experienced by a Gentile Christian in the first century. From what we can tell, the folks on the receiving end of the letter of 1 Peter were experiencing some kind of persecution. It probably wasn't the height of persecution that came a little later, where Christians were being publicly executed, but these little churches were certainly growing strong and numerous enough that they were beginning to run up against the pagan culture in which they were living, and probably, in fact, against the Roman governors, who were often not interested at all in anyone's devotion being directed toward anyone or anything other than them. Now that we know all these things, our reading this morning begins to make a little more sense. You have an inheritance in heaven, though now for a little while you may have to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. And your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in your faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of suffering. A letter written to a community that was feeling the pain of living in a world where their fundamental beliefs were in opposition to the culture around them. It's like you and I are listening to one half of a conversation about a topic wholly unrelated to our lives, right? Or maybe not. I read an article this week by author Nicole Cliff called "How God Messed Up My Happy Atheist Life." In the article, she tells the story of her happy life, professional and personal success, as she describes a very pleasant adult life of firm atheism. The story of her conversion is interesting, but what caught my attention was Nicole's commentary about how her life was different since she's become a follower of Jesus. She writes, "My Christian conversion has granted me no simplicity. It has complicated all of my relationships. It has changed how I feel about money, messed up my public persona, and made me wonder whether I should be on Twitter at all. Obviously, it has been very beautiful." Nicole touches on a reality that many Christians in America have forgotten or choose to ignore. For too long, those of us who identify as Christians have been in the majority in this country, but that is rapidly changing. There are more people of other faiths living in America than ever before, and the most rapidly increasing category of faith for Americans is none. N-O-N-E. Those of us who spend a lot of our time in the life of a Christian community may not have been paying attention to the fact that we are in the minority outside these walls, and worse, because we've been in the majority for too long, we've gotten lazy. You might even say that we have slid off the rigorous course of Christian faith into a watered-down expression of what is at its core a revolutionary gospel. Living a life of radical sacrificial love, we don't even know what that means anymore. We Americans often live like this. We give up a judicious amount of love or patience or money or time or space or comfort for others after an appropriate and very necessary vetting process. And this is an American middle-class stance toward the universe. It is not a Christian one. And we've come to think of this greedy, consumer-oriented, nationalistic way of living, as we often do in this country, as a Christian way of living. That is wrong. Being an American, in other words, is not the same as being a Christian. Just like being a member of the Greco-Roman world was not the same as being a Christian. These identities were and are in conflict with each other. Trying to live as a follower of Jesus in America today should make our reading of 1 Peter seem at least vaguely familiar. And if it doesn't, then we need to take a step back and think hard about the substance of our practiced faith. Our world is very different from the world that the first Christians were living in. But one thing we definitely share is this: Christian faith puts us in conflict with the culture around us. We who call ourselves followers of Jesus cannot turn on our televisions or read our Facebook feeds without a growing awareness that the gospel we claim, if we truly live it, increasingly threatens the status quo, offends powers that be, makes us at the very least unpopular. We profess a revolutionary kind of love. If folks preaching alternative messages of greed and dominance and hatred do not feel the threat of that love, we are not living it right. We hear, part of the beauty of me is that I am very rich. Jesus said, for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. We hear, don't tell me it doesn't work. Torture works. Waterboarding is fine, but it's not nearly enough, okay? And Jesus said, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. We hear the other thing with the terrorists is that you have to take down their families. But Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. We hear, laziness is a trait in blacks. Jesus says, I tell you, on the day of judgment, you will have to give an account for every careless word you utter. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. We hear, the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make U.S. manufacturing non-competitive. Jesus said, look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, but your heavenly Father feeds them. And consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. We hear, I will build a great wall, and nobody builds walls better than me, believe me, and I will build it very inexpensively. I will build a great, great wall on our southern border. I will make Mexico pay for that wall. Mark my words. And Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. You are not paying attention if you don't think there is a serious ideological conflict between these words we hear every day in America and the message of Jesus. We live in a country where someone who says things like this to the cheers of rousing crowds of the American public is one popular election away from the office of president of our country. What does that mean? It means that living in comfort and ease, as if being an American is the same thing as being a Christian, is not an option anymore for real followers of Jesus. Perhaps when we modern readers can hear the words of 1 Peter written to a beleaguered community trying to figure out a way to hold out the gospel message that Jesus came to preach in a world that could not understand what they were talking about, maybe then we can begin to see beyond the cultural Christianity that we have adopted, a cultural Christianity that is a tepid substitute for real discipleship. Because those who called themselves Christians then and those who call ourselves Christians now still have the holy obligation of speaking truth to power, of standing up to evil, of caring for our neighbors, of insisting that love is the only thing that can save us, the only thing. And you might even say that living out that radical love, that radical gospel, is even for us today a matter of life and death. Amen.